On the morning of February 23, 1885, inside Exeter Prison, a 21-year-old former naval seaman named John Lee was led onto a gallows designed to make interpretation unnecessary, because executions are built to eliminate hesitation by collapsing action and outcome into a single unquestioned ending. And everything about that moment had been arranged to ensure that once the lever was pulled, there would be nothing left to discuss, reconsider, or explain. The sentence had already done its work on paper. The ritual had already done its work on expectation. And when the trapdoor opened and Lee fell, the law behaved exactly as it always had, except that the one thing the entire structure depended on did not arrive, because the body beneath the rope continued to breathe, not dramatically or defiantly, but steadily enough that it could not be dismissed, forcing everyone present to remain inside a moment that was not supposed to exist. As that breathing continued, the execution stopped being an execution without becoming anything else yet, leaving the law suspended between having acted and having finished. And in that narrow space, the question quietly shifted away from whether John Lee would die and towards something far more dangerous, which was whether authority could continue once it had been contradicted by reality and had no instructions for what to do next. Welcome to They Actually Did This, a place for the stories that sound exaggerated until you slow down and realize they unfolded exactly this way, not because anyone intended them to spiral, but because systems built on repetition tend to falter the moment something unexpected survives them. And what follows is not a mystery about how a man lived through an execution, but a record of how authority reacted when it discovered that it had reached the edge of its own instructions and had no clean way to move forward without revealing that it was improvising. What made the moment difficult to recognize at first was that nothing about it announced itself as wrong in the way people expect wrongness to appear, because everything visible still resembled what it was supposed to resemble, with the rope taut, the body suspended. The chamber held in that formal, anticipatory quiet that usually signals completion rather than interruption, creating the impression that the ending had already arrived, even as time continued to move forward. Bodies move after death. Everyone there knew that or believed they knew it, and that belief mattered because it offered a small but crucial refuge from having to decide anything too quickly, a way to remain passive for a few seconds longer, while certainty was given the chance to reassert itself and smooth over any discomfort that might otherwise demand attention. So when John Lee's chest lifted, and air moved where air was no longer supposed to move, the first instinct was not alarm, but dismissal, a quiet, internal correction where the mind reached for familiarity and reassured itself that this was normal, expected, not something that required interpretation or response, because interpretation would have meant acknowledging that the moment had slipped outside its intended shape. Someone noticed and chose not to say anything, while someone else noticed and chose not to look directly. Not out of indifference, but out of instinct, because looking directly would have meant accepting that this movement was not reflex or residual motion, not the body finishing something it had already begun, but something else entirely that carried consequences no one was prepared to claim. The breathing continued in a way that did not announce itself as struggle or defiance, but as something quieter and more unsettling, a small, steady rise and fall that forced anyone paying attention to keep recalibrating what they were witnessing, because it was neither dramatic enough to provoke immediate action, nor subtle enough to be dismissed as imagination, and that ambiguity made it harder rather than easier to endure. It was the kind of movement that required watching twice to be sure, the kind that made people glance and then look away and then glance again, each time hoping it would have stopped in the interval so they would not have to decide what it meant. And when it did not stop, when it continued at the same measured pace, it began to feel less like a bodily reflex and more like a presence lingering where an absence had been expected. As that presence persisted, the air in the chamber seemed to grow heavier, not because anything physical had changed, but because attention had, because every breath that continued forced everyone in the room to remain inside the moment rather than move past it. And remaining inside it meant carrying the growing awareness that the execution was no longer behaving like an ending. Nothing else in the room responded with urgency, and no one spoke, not because silence felt appropriate, but because speech would have turned an unspoken discomfort into a formal problem, and formal problems demand decisions, which in turn leave traces that can be examined later. The space held itself in a kind of suspended stillness, broken only by that faint, persistent sign of life. And the longer it continued, the clearer it became that this was not a brief delay waiting to resolve itself, but a condition that was quietly insisting on being acknowledged without ever demanding it outright. Attention began to shift unevenly, not all at once but in small adjustments, as people stopped watching the body directly and began watching one another instead, measuring faces and posture, waiting for authority to provide permission to feel something other than expectation. Because when certainty falters, people instinctively look sideways for cues rather than forward for answers. The executioner remained motionless, not because he failed to see what was happening, but because seeing and interpreting are not the same thing, and interpretation had never been part of his task, which meant that even as doubt crept into the room, motion itself felt like a decision he was not authorized to make. Officials felt the pressure building as well, the slow realization that the execution had not failed loudly enough to demand immediate correction, but had not succeeded cleanly enough to disappear into record, leaving them suspended in a narrow space where procedure had been followed carefully, and yet outcome had refused to arrive. This was the most dangerous kind of failure, the kind that does not announce itself as error, but lingers just long enough to invite interpretation without providing guidance. Because systems built on ritual are designed to eliminate ambiguity rather than manage it, and ambiguity, once present, has a way of spreading. At some point, denial stopped functioning, not because anyone consciously rejected it, but because it required too much effort to maintain, because it demanded that people continue telling themselves a story that no longer aligned with what they were watching unfold in front of them, and that misalignment became increasingly difficult to ignore. Still, no one spoke, because speaking would have meant crossing a threshold, turning a shared unease into an acknowledged problem, and acknowledged problems require ownership, which no one present had been prepared to assume. What made the moment unbearable was not suffering alone, but exposure. The exposure of a gap between what the law expected to happen and what was actually happening. A gap that everyone in the room could now see and feel, but did not yet know how to close without consequence. The execution had already been carried out according to procedure. The sentence had already been enacted in form, and yet the body refused to align with the ending everyone had been promised, creating a contradiction that could not be resolved by waiting any longer, which meant that the story people had arrived expecting to witness and then leave behind had not finished telling itself. And as that realization settled unevenly through the chamber, it became clear that nothing that followed would feel like a continuation of what had already happened, only a correction imposed after the fact. And corrections, once acknowledged, require someone to own them. Once it became impossible to pretend that nothing unusual was happening, once the breathing had continued long enough that denial required more effort than acknowledgement, the situation did not collapse into chaos or outrage the way people often imagine moments like this should, because institutions rarely respond to uncertainty by stopping, and rarely respond by questioning themselves. So instead, the moment began to repeat itself, not loudly or dramatically, but through pattern. The quiet instinct to keep doing what has already been done in the hope that repetition will eventually produce the outcome that reflection might complicate. The assumption underneath every movement that followed was never spoken aloud. Still, it shaped everything nonetheless, which was that something must have gone wrong mechanically rather than conceptually. Because mechanical failures can be corrected without embarrassment, while conceptual failures require explanation. Explanation requires admitting that the rules do not fully account for reality. Attention drifted away from the fact that John Lee was still alive and toward the apparatus itself, toward the rope, the platform, the lever, because objects are easier to interrogate than outcomes, and focusing on them allowed everyone present to feel as though progress was being made without anyone having to decide what progress actually meant. Hands adjusted knots that did not appear loose. Eyes followed movements that did not change the underlying condition. Voices remained low, measured, careful, not because anyone feared being overheard, but because speaking too clearly risked turning an unspoken discomfort into a formal problem, and formal problems demand solutions that can be traced back to the people who proposed them. What repetition provided was activity without commitment, a way to remain in motion while avoiding interpretation, because each reset of the mechanism carried with it the quiet hope that this time the expected ending would finally arrive on its own, absolving everyone of responsibility for having noticed that something was wrong in the first place. When the lever was pulled again and the result failed to change, the repetition stripped away the last comfort of accident, because once something fails twice under identical conditions, it stops looking like chance and begins to look tolerated. Tolerance, even when unspoken, carries responsibility whether anyone claims it or not. Still, the instinct was not to stop, but to continue, because stopping would have required acknowledging that the pattern itself was the response, and acknowledging that would have meant admitting that no one knew what should happen next. As the mechanism was reset again, the room began to change in ways that had nothing to do with sound or movement, and everything to do with attention, because repetition alters atmosphere by replacing expectation with dread. And each attempt that failed to resolve the moment made the space feel smaller, more crowded, less willing to release the people inside it. Some in the room would have begun to feel impatience rise, not directed at the man, but at the situation itself, because impatience often arrives when uncertainty lingers too long without permission to resolve. And impatience seeks endings even when endings are unpleasant. Others would have felt the opposite, a tightening reluctance, the awareness that each repetition made the next one harder to justify, because repetition exposes intent in a way single actions do not, and intent invites scrutiny. What made this escalation so unsettling was that nothing new was happening, and yet everything was changing, because with each repeated attempt, the execution moved further away from being an event and closer to being a condition. Something ongoing rather than finite, something that demanded management rather than witnessing. The pattern began to reveal its true function, which was not correction but delay, not resolution but avoidance, because as long as the process could be reset, the decision itself could be deferred. And deferral felt safer than choosing in a moment where every option carried consequences that extended far beyond the body beneath the rope. By the time it became clear that repetition was no longer disguising uncertainty but advertising it, that each attempt was making the hesitation more visible rather than less, the pattern had already done its work, because it had transformed the failure from a single anomaly into a sustained situation, one that could no longer be ignored or absorbed quietly. The execution had not ended. It had stalled, and stalling, once noticed, carries its own kind of momentum, because it forces the people responsible to either break the pattern or be defined by it, and breaking it would require admitting that repetition had been a choice rather than a necessity, which meant that escalation did not arrive as panic or violence, but as persistence, the steady insistence on continuing to do something rather than confronting the possibility that the moment itself had slipped beyond the instructions meant to contain it. And with each repetition, the room learned something it was never meant to learn, which was that authority does not always know what comes next, and that knowledge, once glimpsed, cannot be entirely unseen. What shifted at this point was not the condition of the man beneath the rope, but the condition of the people responsible for explaining why the moment was still happening. Because once repetition failed to produce the expected ending, the problem could no longer be treated as mechanical, without stretching credibility past the point where anyone felt safe standing behind it. Authority does not panic when things go wrong. It recalibrates, and recalibration often looks like stillness rather than action, because stillness buys time without creating a record, and records are where responsibility begins to settle in ways that cannot be easily brushed aside later. the officials present would have begun to feel the weight of interpretation pressing inward, not as a philosophical concern, but as a practical one, because interpretation requires choosing language, and language creates meaning, and meaning has consequences that extend beyond the room into memory, rumor, and precedent. They would have been turning the sentence over in their minds without admitting it to one another, listening to the phrasing echo internally, searching for whether it demanded an outcome or merely prescribed a process. Because if the law could be understood as requiring only that the act be carried out rather than that death actually arrive, then perhaps the contradiction could be contained without rewriting anything at all. That distinction would have felt uncomfortably thin, because it asked them to accept that intention mattered more than result. And intention, once elevated above result, becomes a justification flexible enough to support almost anything, a realization that likely remained unspoken precisely because of how far it reached. At the same time, attention would have drifted toward the witnesses, not out of fear of outrage, but out of concern for interpretation, because outrage can be punished and sympathy can be redirected. But interpretation spreads quietly, carried through glances and pauses, and the subtle recognition that something is being negotiated rather than commanded. The longer the hesitation remained visible, the more dangerous it became. Not because it threatened immediate disorder, but because it exposed the fact that authority was thinking rather than knowing. And thinking, when observed, undermines the illusion of inevitability that allows authority to function without constant resistance. No one wanted to be the first to speak, because the first voice would frame the problem, and framing determines which options feel available, and once an option is named, it becomes accountable, traceable back to the person who allowed it to exist in the open. Allowing the man to live would have required acknowledging that survival could interrupt punishment once punishment had already begun, which would have quietly transformed execution from a final act into a conditional one, dependent on bodies behaving as expected rather than on sentences being carried out as written. Insisting on continuing would have required acknowledging the opposite, that authority could override contradiction through repetition alone, a declaration that reality itself was subordinate to procedure, a position that carries its own risks once articulated. Neither option felt stable, and stability was the unspoken goal, not justice or mercy, but continuity, the assurance that whatever happened next would not require explanation beyond the room or revision beyond the moment. As seconds continued to pass, the hesitation itself began to feel heavier than either possible decision, because hesitation is tolerable only as long as it remains invisible, and this hesitation had become legible, written into posture, into eye movement, into the way no one quite knew where to stand anymore. Time pressed in not as urgency but as exposure, because every moment spent not acting transformed the pause into evidence. Evidence that could later be pointed to as the instant when authority did not know what to do. And once that evidence exists, it cannot be fully erased. What narrowed the path forward was not clarity, but fatigue, the growing understanding that the pause could not be sustained indefinitely without teaching the wrong lesson. The lesson that authority depends not on certainty, but on cooperation, and cooperation falters once people realize they are being asked to wait for a decision rather than receive one. This was not a moral crossroads because morality would have required deliberation, and deliberation would have required time, and time was precisely what the moment no longer had, which meant that whatever happened next would be chosen not because it resolved the contradiction, but because it ended the visibility of it. And as that realization settled into the room, quietly and collectively, the range of acceptable actions collapsed inward on its own, not announced, not voted on, but felt, until continuation began to seem less like a choice and more like the only way to restore the appearance that nothing extraordinary had happened at all. What made the pause so difficult to endure was not only that the execution had failed to end, but that it had done so in lives already crowded with things that refused to conclude cleanly, because most of the people standing there had long since learned to measure their days not by comfort or satisfaction, but by how much uncertainty they could absorb without it interfering with the next obligation waiting for them. as they stood watching a moment past where it was supposed to stop, that private accounting continued in the background. The quiet awareness of work left unfinished, of illness unattended, of money already spent before it was earned. And standing here longer than expected was not simply uncomfortable, but costly in ways that were difficult to articulate without sounding petty or disloyal, which made the discomfort easier to internalize than to express. Authority, in that world, was not an idea debated in the abstract, but a practical force that shaped behavior through habit rather than belief. Something you oriented yourself around carefully because resisting it rarely produced improvement and often produced additional trouble. And over time, that calculation became automatic, embedded in posture and tone and expectation. Public punishment fit neatly into that structure, not because people desired cruelty, but because it performed a stabilizing function, offering visible finality in a world where so much else remained open-ended, unresolved, and resistant to closure. And that finality mattered because it allowed people to return to their lives without carrying one more unanswered question with them. Executions were not spectacles that interrupted daily life so much as punctuation that allowed it to continue. Grim markers that signaled that at least some lines were still being enforced, somewhere, by someone, in a way that felt dependable, even if it felt harsh. That was the unspoken expectation carried into the chamber that morning. The understanding that whatever discomfort the execution produced would at least be contained, finite, and absorbable, something that could be witnessed and then folded back into the ongoing effort of living without requiring further attention. When the execution refused to finish, it did more than disrupt a ritual. It added weight to lives already balanced carefully, because unresolved moments demand vigilance, and vigilance requires energy, and energy was already being spent on survival itself. In that context, the continued breathing did not feel like hope or reprieve, because hope requires the belief that change is possible, and for many present, change had long since ceased to feel accessible, replaced instead by endurance, the quieter goal of getting through what was already in front of you. Instead, survival registered as extension, an unwanted prolonging of a moment that had already asked for more attention than anyone had prepared to give, and that extension mattered because it threatened to carry the uncertainty outward, following people home, sitting with them afterward, becoming one more unresolved thing in lives already full of them. Some would have felt sympathy rise and then suppress it, not because sympathy was absent, but because engaging with it would have required staying inside the moment longer, and staying longer meant letting the uncertainty spread into parts of life that could not afford it. Others would have felt irritation surface unexpectedly, not directed at the man, but at the situation itself, at the way the moment seemed to ignore the unspoken agreement that suffering, however grim, would at least be efficient, and that efficiency was one of the few mercies people had learned to rely on. These reactions were not articulated or shared because articulation implies choice, and choice implies agency. And agency was something many had learned to downplay to avoid constant frustration in a world where control was unevenly distributed and rarely rewarded. Instead, the pressure accumulated without language, settling into the room the way weather does when it is about to turn, shaping expectation without anyone needing to articulate it, because articulation would have implied debate. And debate was not something most people felt equipped to participate in, especially not here, especially not now. Attention drifted back toward the officials, not with accusation or demand, but with a quieter assumption that had been learned long before this morning, the assumption that authority existed to absorb uncertainty so that ordinary people did not have to carry it home with them, and that whatever was about to happen needed to happen soon enough to prevent this moment from attaching itself to everything that came after. The longer the pause remained unresolved, the more it threatened to spill outward, to follow people beyond the prison walls, to sit beside them at work, at meals, in the small private spaces where unfinished things tend to multiply. And that possibility mattered more than fairness or mercy or correctness, because unresolved moments do not stay contained. They spread. What people wanted was not punishment or restraint, but containment. The sense that this strange interruption could be sealed off and returned to the category of things that happen and then stop happening. Because the alternative was carrying one more unfinished weight into lives already structured around endurance. By the time that collective expectation settled fully into place, it no longer needed to be expressed to be understood, because it had taken on the shape of necessity, the quiet understanding that whatever came next would need to restore predictability, not introduce reflection, and that restoration, however it arrived, would be accepted simply because it allowed the moment to end. Not because it was right, but because it could not be allowed to continue. As the expectation that something needed to happen settled into the room without anyone naming it, another instinct began to surface alongside it, quieter but persistent, the instinct to reach backward rather than forward, because when the present becomes unstable, the past offers the illusion of footing, even when that footing is uneven and incomplete. Someone would have remembered hearing about executions that went wrong before, not in detail, not with dates or names, but as impressions passed along through conversation and rumor, stories of ropes snapping or mechanisms failing or sentences interrupted at the last possible moment. And those half-remembered accounts mattered not because they provided guidance, but because they suggested that this moment was not entirely without precedent, which made it feel marginally less dangerous. Another would have recalled that the law had always found a way to absorb irregularities without collapsing, that failures could be framed as accidents, and accidents could be corrected quietly, and that reassurance, however thin, allowed the mind to keep functioning when the present refused to settle. These recollections did not arrive as coherent narratives, but as fragments, impressions rather than lessons, because no one was searching for accuracy in that moment, only for something familiar enough to lean on, something that implied that uncertainty had been encountered before and survived. The appeal of precedent was not that it offered clarity, but that it suggested containment. The comforting idea that whatever was happening now could be folded into an existing category rather than forcing the creation of a new one, because new categories demand explanation, and explanation demands exposure. What mattered most was not whether those remembered stories aligned precisely with what was unfolding in front of them, but that they existed at all. That they allowed people to tell themselves that this strange pause was not unprecedented, not singular, not the kind of thing that would require extraordinary response. In reaching for those past moments, people were not trying to solve the problem so much as reduce it, to shrink the present down until it resembled something already absorbed by memory, something that had not lingered long enough to alter how authority was understood afterward. The danger, unspoken but felt, was that if this moment could not be aligned with something that had happened before, it might demand a new response, and new responses create records, and records preserve uncertainty in ways that make it difficult to pretend later that everything unfolded as expected. So the past was allowed to hover just close enough to offer reassurance without demanding comparison, a hazy outline of previous disruptions that had eventually resolved themselves without consequence. And that outline made it easier to believe that this, too, would find a way to conclude without requiring anyone to articulate how. What no one lingered on was how often those past stories had only seemed resolved because they had been simplified in retelling, because complexity tends to fade while outcomes remain, and the outcome, whatever it became, was all that most people wanted to carry forward from this moment as well. The invocation of precedent did not slow the pressure, it redirected it. By imagining that this had happened before, the present became something to endure rather than something to interrogate, and endurance felt safer than examination, because examination risks uncovering gaps that cannot be closed cleanly. As that thought settled in, unevenly and without consensus, it created a fragile bridge between what was happening and what needed to happen next. Not a solution, but a permission. The quiet allowance to proceed without fully understanding, trusting that whatever explanation was required could be assembled later, once the moment itself had been sealed off. And in that sense, the past did its work, not by instructing, but by anesthetizing. dulling the sharpest edge of uncertainty just enough that movement forward began to feel possible again, even if no one could yet say exactly what that movement would look like. What finally pushed the moment forward was not agreement or resolve, but the slow realization that remaining exactly where they were had begun to feel more dangerous than moving, because the pause had stretched long enough that it was no longer simply a gap between actions, but a condition in its own right, one that was beginning to define the situation rather than merely interrupt it. Stillness had started to attract attention in ways no one wanted. Not dramatic attention or confrontation, but the quiet, cumulative kind that comes from too many people noticing the same hesitation at the same time, and that shared noticing created a pressure that did not need to be spoken to be felt. No one announced what needed to happen next, because an announcement would have implied certainty, and certainty was precisely what had evaporated, leaving behind only the more practical concern of how to make the moment stop expanding any further. Movement began cautiously, almost tentatively, as though each person involved wanted to be able to tell themselves later that they had merely responded to circumstances rather than initiated anything. And that distinction mattered because initiation implies responsibility in a way response does not. Hands shifted first, not to act, but to adjust, to touch familiar objects and confirm that they were still there, that the world of procedure still existed and could still be interacted with, even if its meaning had become unstable. Postures changed. Not because relief had arrived, but because the body recognizes when a pause has become unsustainable and begins preparing itself for whatever comes next, without knowing what that will be. What guided these early movements was not a plan, so much as a shared instinct to reduce exposure, because exposure had become the most immediate threat, more pressing than contradiction or consequence, and reducing it felt achievable in a way resolution did not. The body beneath the rope was no longer being watched in the same way. Not because it mattered less, but because watching it had begun to feel accusatory, as though observation itself was demanding an explanation no one was prepared to provide. Attention shifted instead toward tasks that could be framed as maintenance rather than choice, steps that could later be described as necessary adjustments rather than decisions, because necessity shields people from accountability more effectively than intention ever could. John Lee was lowered gradually, not in a way that suggested mercy or reprieve, but in a way that suggested management, the handling of a situation that had become inconveniently visible and needed to be relocated rather than resolved. As he was cut down and moved away from the center of the chamber, the atmosphere changed again, not toward relief, but toward a fragile containment, the sense that whatever had gone wrong was at least no longer happening in front of witnesses. That containment mattered more than correctness, because correctness would have required agreement, and agreement would have required naming the problem, and naming the problem would have required someone to accept responsibility for it. What followed unfolded with the quiet efficiency of routine reasserting itself, not because routine fit the moment particularly well, but because it offered a script when none other was available, allowing people to continue acting without having to confront the fact that the script had already failed them once. The plan did not fail loudly or dramatically, because loud failures demand response and dramatic failures demand explanation, and explanation was precisely what everyone was trying to avoid. Instead, it failed by becoming something else entirely, no longer an attempt to complete the execution, but an attempt to end the visibility of the problem it had created, to move the contradiction out of sight where it could be dealt with later, privately, selectively, and with far fewer implications. In that sense, the moment did not resolve. It contracted, shrinking inward until it could be carried away rather than confronted, and that contraction was treated as success simply because it allowed the room to empty and the pause to stop being shared. As attention dispersed and the space began to return to something resembling order, the knowledge that nothing had truly been settled remained present, but it was no longer collective, no longer immediate, and that separation alone was enough to let the institution proceed as though the interruption had been temporary rather than foundational. What had failed was not the mechanism alone, but the assumption that the moment would end cleanly on its own, and that failure was absorbed quietly, redistributed across procedure and time until it no longer belonged to any single person or decision. And in that quiet redistribution, the plan achieved its real purpose, not resolution, but escape, the ability to move forward without having to explain how close authority had come to admitting that it did not know what to do. What followed did not separate itself cleanly from what had just happened, because separation requires distance, and distance had not yet formed, leaving instead the sensation that the execution was no longer occurring in front of everyone, but was still present all the same, clinging to posture and attention as people began to move without quite understanding whether they were leaving something behind or carrying it with them. The act of walking away did not feel like a departure so much as a thinning, the slow dilution of a shared experience into smaller, quieter versions that could be held privately without ever needing to be reconciled. And that thinning mattered because what is shared demands consensus, while what is private can remain unresolved without consequence. No one spoke as they moved, not because silence felt respectful or shocked, but because speech would have required choosing language, and language would have fixed the shape of something that still refused to hold still. And once a shape is fixed, it can be examined, questioned, and returned to later, which was precisely what everyone was trying to avoid. Instead, attention turned inward, each person instinctively editing the experience as it receded, trimming away the parts that resisted explanation and keeping the parts that could be placed into familiar patterns, because familiarity is not comforting so much as stabilizing, and stability was the only thing this moment seemed to promise if handled carefully enough. Memory began working immediately, not as reflection, but as filtration, reducing the event even as it was still unfolding, because memory does not wait politely for time to pass. It intervenes at once, shaping perception so that what remains feels survivable. And in that shaping, uncertainty is always the first thing to be compressed. For some, the execution became something that had taken longer than expected, an inconvenience rather than a rupture, a delay rather than a contradiction, and that reframing mattered because it allowed the experience to settle without altering anything else about how authority was understood. For others, the repetition lingered longer, not as outrage or fear, but as a dull unease, the sense that something had been attempted more than once without producing the certainty it was meant to guarantee, a realization that did not lead anywhere productive and therefore slowly receded, because unresolved realizations tend to exhaust themselves when there is nowhere safe to place them. As these private versions took hold, the shared version narrowed by necessity, because shared stories cannot tolerate too much complexity without fracturing. And fracture was the one thing everyone sensed needed to be avoided, even if no one articulated why. Official language followed the same instinct without needing to be directed, because institutions are structured to preserve continuity rather than interrogation, and continuity depends on description that emphasizes sequence over hesitation and process over doubt, allowing events to be recorded without absorbing the discomfort of having lived through them. Mechanical failure, interrupted procedure, return to custody. Phrases like these began to hover where experience had been, not because they were false, but because they were incomplete in a way that made them usable, converting a sustained uncertainty into a series of manageable actions that could be documented, referenced, and eventually set aside. What disappeared in that conversion was not the knowledge that something had gone wrong, but the sensation of being present in a moment where no one knew what should happen next, because sensation resists storage, and uncertainty resists neutral description. As time moved forward unevenly, the pause shortened further in recollection, not through deliberate revision, but through attrition, because unresolved time is difficult to hold on to, and the mind naturally compresses what cannot be integrated into a clear sequence, turning conditions into intervals and intervals into footnotes. The continued breathing became a detail. The hesitation became an instant. The weight of the moment became something that could be referenced without being re-entered. What remained was a story that sounded strange but complete, something that could be mentioned and then put away, a curiosity rather than a warning, and that transformation mattered because warnings demand change, while curiosities ask only to be noticed briefly. Yet beneath that settled surface, something quieter persisted, not loudly enough to demand attention, but steadily enough to matter. A recalibration that occurred without instruction as people absorbed the knowledge that authority could hesitate and then continue without consequence, learning without being told that pauses do not necessarily interrupt power. They simply become part of how it operates. That lesson did not announce itself or seek reflection, because lessons learned through observation rarely do, but it altered expectation nonetheless, making future hesitation easier to overlook and future insistence easier to accept, because the system had demonstrated that it could absorb contradiction, compress it, and carry on without visible damage. Memory did not erase what happened, and it did not resolve it either, but contained it just enough to keep it from spreading, just enough to keep the most unsettling part of the moment, the part where no one knew what should come next, buried beneath a version of events that felt complete enough to stop thinking about. What made punishment impossible was not that nothing wrong had happened, but that there was never a moment where wrongdoing stood still long enough to be separated from everything surrounding it, because by the time anyone could have asked who was responsible, the question itself had already dissolved into the structure that produced the moment in the first place, spreading outward through procedure, habit, and expectation, until it no longer belonged clearly enough to anyone to be claimed. Responsibility did not disappear suddenly or dramatically. It thinned, stretched across so many hands and roles and assumptions that it lost its shape, becoming something felt rather than defined, something that existed everywhere lightly instead of anywhere heavily, which made it impossible to grasp without also pulling apart the entire framework that had allowed the execution to proceed as far as it did. Nothing that had happened could be pointed to cleanly without also pointing to something else, because each action had arrived already justified by the one before it, each adjustment framed as a response rather than choice, until choice itself became difficult to locate, not denied outright but quietly displaced by the language of necessity. The executioner had acted, but only within the motion he had been trained to repeat, never stepping outside the mechanism, never altering the ritual, and that obedience mattered because obedience absorbs blame by transforming intention into function, allowing action to exist without ownership. The officials had responded, but only to what was immediately visible, narrowing their focus to containment rather than resolution, because containment could be achieved without explanation, while resolution would have required admitting that the moment itself did not fit cleanly inside the law as written. The law remained untouched, not because it had worked perfectly, but because touching it would have required acknowledging that it relied on conditions it did not control, bodies that were supposed to behave, mechanisms that were supposed to comply, outcomes that were supposed to arrive on time, and acknowledging that dependency would have exposed how fragile certainty actually was. By the time the situation had been reduced enough to be survivable, there was no longer a single action that could be revisited without reopening everything else. No clean edge where accountability could be cut free from continuity, because continuity had already been restored, and restoration carries its own authority once it has occurred. Punishment depends on clarity, on a visible line between what should have happened and what did, and that line never fully formed here, because hesitation and action overlapped too closely, because necessity replaced deliberation before deliberation ever had room to exist. What remained was not innocence or guilt, but momentum, the quiet fact that the system had continued, and continuation retroactively justified everything required to achieve it. Not because it was correct, but because it was complete. To punish someone would have meant reopening the moment, pulling it back into visibility, allowing it to spread again, and the entire purpose of what followed had been to ensure that spreading did not occur. So responsibility was allowed to remain diffuse, not by accident, but because diffusion was the only state that preserved stability, and stability mattered more than explanation once the pause had been sealed off. Nothing needed to be said aloud. Nothing needed to be corrected. The system demonstrated what it needed to demonstrate simply by moving forward. And once it did, there was no longer a place for punishment to land, without also admitting that authority itself had been the thing exposed. And that was never going to happen. John Lee lived not because the law made room for survival, but because the law did not know how to respond to it in that moment. And when it finally found a way to continue without addressing the contradiction directly, survival became something that could be carried forward quietly, reframed as anomaly rather than interruption, and eventually softened into a story that sounded strange without sounding threatening. He would be released years later, not as a correction, not as an admission, but as another quiet adjustment that allowed the story to resolve itself without reopening the space where uncertainty had once been visible. And that resolution mattered less for what it said about him than for what it revealed about how institutions protect themselves when certainty fails. What this moment exposes, without ever announcing it, is that authority does not need to be right to endure. It only needs to remain intact long enough for memory to reorganize itself around continuation rather than question. And once that happens, even the most unsettling, and they actually did this,